Good morning. Welcome to the Practice Community webinar in order to support national plans of adaptation to climate change in Latin America and the Caribbean. I would like to ask if you can hear me well. I will start then. My name is Lily Dieva and I will be the moderator of this webinar. For those of you who have not used VoiceBoxer platform before, I will give some brief instructions in order to facilitate the use. You can choose the language to listen to on the bottom of the page. You can choose to whether listen to Spanish or to English, the simultaneous interpretation into English. If you have any technical problems, please hit the question mark on the bottom left hand of the screen. If you do so, our colleagues from VoiceBoxer will give you technical support. If your screen freezes or the audio cuts, you can just refresh your browser so we can solve this. Once again, welcome you all. It is a pleasure to have you in today's webinar. I would like to give some words to say something about the practice community. This practice community for the support of national plans of adaptation to climate change is an initiative of UN Environment through the Regatta Project, the regional project of technology transfer and action facing the climate change. This initiative is being implemented with practical action. The office in Latin America and Peru. The PNAC community offers the officials, which is the aim of the community, to get involved in the elaboration of national plan of adaptation in each of their countries. There is an opportunity to support each other through exchange of good practices in this matter and to receive support from specialists, researchers from the NAC society and civil society. This exchange will be done through a website and a forum, and also through a series of webinars, just like today's and the other two webinars we had are open for specialists of adaptation to climate change, and so we can facilitate exchange of knowledge of different stakeholders in this topic. Something that comes up in the negotiations on climate is to identify synergies of adaptation and mitigation of climate change as something important of comprehensive policy for climate change. However, we define there are many factors and challenges, whether scientific, like for example the identification of scope, the type of finance, the proper finance, etc. For these considerations, to allow the synergy between mitigation and adaptation. Having this in mind, this third webinar part of this module on planification, or planning of national plans of adaptation to climate change will address the planning and opportunities for synergies and with mitigation. We have the pleasure to have the pleasure of welcoming Fernando Carlino, specialist in public and climate policies, coordinator in Argentina, and Claudia Brundler. She's a specialist in climate change, human resources, and agriculture of UN Environment. I would like to say also that we have a question and answer panel with the participants and speakers, and questions will be ask after the presentations. So if you have any questions, just write them down and you can share your questions after the two presentations through the chat. Your question will be translated in English or in English or in Spanish and will be answered by each presenter. Having said that, I have the pleasure to welcome Hernando Carlino, specialist in climatic environment policies, coordinator of the Study Center of Global Climate Change in Argentina. He is actually connected from Barcelona. He will present visions of adaptation and mitigation. He will give us a panorama on the evaluation of business and financial opportunities for planning. I'm looking for synergies for planning. Just a minute, I will give the floor to Hernan. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this practice community, to Regatta and UN Environment. It is a pleasure to be able to talk about this. I am the coordinator of Study Center of Climate Change, the global one of the UN Foundation based in Argentina that works all topics regarding environment, especially policies of climate change, about 2 years ago. I have to address this topic, and the title is quite hermetic, I would say, incision and convergence, contrasting optics. Why do I say this? Because in general, there was this sensation, the feeling that adaptation and mitigation were two different things, following two different paths. In a sense, mitigations will go for a broad, and mitigation will go for rural roads, less developed roads, without sanitation, some difficulties in order to progress. So that is the difference of mitigation, and the other thing are different. But the idea is that we should have in a point some sort of convergence, necessary convergence, and valuable. So these are the contents. In general, I normally do not respect the times. I was told that I had around 20 minutes for developing this topic, so I will see the genesis of the differences, how mitigation adaptation will go in a convergence direction, how different agencies and different institutions deal with these adaptation plans, and the deal, so if it's possible to synergize, or if we have to recover the vision of comprehension of a whole, which is different, but it is something that should be done comprehensible. We will talk about financing, which plays a key factor in this role, and final comment. Contrasting optics. Where did they come? First, there was some sort of difference between negotiation in the treatment of this topic along the time through the international negotiation of both topics, in the way countries looked at this. So here I have some points of this difference of this negotiation. The first thing I would like to mention is that in the origin of the problem, in order to act on this origin of the problem, we think about mitigation. As for example, we look for the CO2 emissions, greenhouse effects emissions to mitigate climate change, and the mitigation was conceived as acting on consequences of the problem. I have to remind you that when we started to discuss at the beginning of the 90s, 1992, when we started preparing the basic text of the convention, we thought that we had some sort of time for the mitigation to act. So adaptation was a subordinate activity because all effort was concentrated in mitigating, and we hoped that this would result in something. So adaptation component would be a central component. Secondly, there's an articulation with the principles. There is a difference that has to do with the vision of underdeveloped and developing countries. The underdeveloped countries, developing countries, stressing stressing the responsibility. They had been stressing the responsibility, but we were suggesting that the responsibility of mitigation will belong to the rich countries, or the ones that arrived the first through this great industrial development, or whatever you say this. And by contrast, it was something that this was something claimed by the developing countries. And then we address this image with the adaptation of climate change, where happening in the with best impact in the South Hemisphere, and therefore this could be an economic mitigation, because when we do not accomplish articulating into something efficient in mitigation, there is an stagnation of processes, so the causes a bigger impact on the planet. But there is the idea of developing countries, since they maybe because they are more vulnerable, they suffer the most the impacts of climate change, and a difference treatment regarding finance, something that has taken a lot of time. When we look at the numbers of the importance of resources that are available for mitigation and adaptation, the difference is important. It's critical. And if we see the statistic or estimations done by the CPI, the climate policy, there's a great difference. Adaptation is something that is quite low of the assignation of the results. Something has to do with the scientific matters. This has to do with the global process. Emissions go to the atmosphere, and there they are concentrated, whether from the south, from the north, they concentrate. So science of mitigation goes towards one point. Mitigation has a really important phenomenon of progress, and that evolved from the theoretical concept towards practice, adaptation, and community of practice is an example of this. Science of adaptation is more linked to understanding the local phenomena, and then regional, and then national phenomena, and then global phenomena. This is something that we see lower, that goes talking about metrics and accountability. Metrics and accounting is at the bottom part, but the idea is for mitigation and for emissions, you normally have, or the international climate regime has some sort of metric. Since they invented that, the countries just do the detailed accounting of their emissions in each sector for adaptation. So for adaptation, there was not a similar matrix, and it is in the process of being elaborated because it is not something that is easy. And there's also the idea of adaptation matter. We have an interesting vision to see if we have this perspective, we create these scenarios, we estimate the impacts of these scenarios, and then we figure how to intervene to avoid the impacts, to decrease or help the consequences of those impacts. On the other hand, mitigation appears or has a different exposed method. We do the inventory once the emissions happened. So this related to the concepts, to the international policy of climate change in the climate change matter, regarding the nature of science and accounting rules, make the treatment of adaptation mitigation go two separate ways, to say the least. Here I would like to mention that I think it is important to think about the possibility of synergies and how to develop better national adaptation plans, because countries have been facing, at least for as long as I can remember, they're facing some things that should be developed from actions implemented jointly in 95, and then project activities for green development, and then the idea of developing strategies based in low emissions, the mitigation strategies, more recently the contributions determine and preview at the national level, and towards the future the strategies of development of countries that should represent in Malaysia in 2020. But there are many things that countries had to learn, especially developing countries, which were the ones that have less technical capacities, with some exceptions, of course. So there is a learning of new ideas, new concepts, and plans and programs that we need to do successively with speed. So thinking about this, it is important to think how to elaborate a better plan. It's worth it. Considering that there is a difference of these two roads, and then consider this difference has been present since the beginning of the 90s, from the signature of this convention, clearly there was a priority of mitigation, which was natural. So the idea of solving a problem, the presence of the argument of this responsibility, different but joined, acted as a driver for developing countries should concentrate in this, because they had an importance, especially if we include the BRICS, South Africa, China, Russia, India, etc., which was of a bigger importance. Developing countries had contributed to global emissions. That was not a lot, quite reduced. And then we had another difference, which was a North-South division that continued as part of an approach that could be political, cultural, etc. So this was an approach that was difficult to modify in a way. So this process of mitigation was delayed if we consider the European Union met the indications, but actually the convention was not met. So we started the protocol, and the protocol had some problem because important stakeholders did not participate. And what we see is that emissions continue growing, and greenhouse gases concentrations, the atmosphere was pierced, so there is a serious problem. Things or mitigations did not achieve the impact, and from the Paris Agreement, we are facing a situation where we have some future for this thing to improve. So the impact is growing. There are some reasons to think that even when mitigation is key, continues to be key, adaptation has gained importance in the agenda, and especially in the worrying of the countries. The evidence of several impacts make tragic, make the worrying for adaptation to be there and to gain importance. I would say that 2015, with a failed attempt in Copenhagen, we are facing a situation that is different. I would even be dramatically different. The fact of that the international community privilege integrated action, the cooperation says that it is not the right way to solve this problem instead of individual solutions, and that we do not have the possibility to define something in the long term. There are some countries that do nothing, thinking that the effort should be done by other countries. And we also have the hierarchy of adaptation for a global environment framed by the Paris Agreement. Where there is a change, radical change. Adaptation has a hierarchy. And a point was reached that is supposed to be there from the moment. So the agreement also generates new information mechanisms. Countries should present a communication of adaptation, so there is a process where the requirements to inform regarding adaptation start to be almost similar to adaptation. As for science, the IPCC reports start to show not new evidences of new problems, but the reaffirmation that all problems already identified were gaining importance, were acuting. So the idea of having some breaking points that could be extremely would cause extreme risks, and the idea of where we could reach some situations where there will be irreversible changes that would affect the situation of the planet that is still hard to understand. And then there's the financing part, where the idea of financing should be equivalent to the financing for mitigation, for example. The Green Fund for Climate, that adaptation to climate change should be spread the resources evenly. here is that we have different guidelines, I would say, for national adaptation plans. And I did a small effort of compiling, of gathering some of these orientations. In this case, the idea is that for an integration of national adaptation plans, contributions determined at the national level, and also important objectives developing goals within the millennium should be taken into account. So this, performing this, and this is something, it's a guideline gathered by the FEO, and then we talk about integrated governance building, prioritization, meaning that first governance should be first, and then capacity building in order to carry out the plan. The idea of prioritization, we need to prioritize the needs that we have and to see what we addressed. The first, the possibility to have integrated frameworks for financing. When we present a proposal for the Green Fund, we need to consider also that the impacts, if it's a mitigation initiative, the impacts represent a lot of the proposal, and the way that the countries through these plans should monitor the resource assignation, financing, resources, or the transparency. So monitoring and reporting should be an activity, an important, not at the last part, but an important part, because that allowed us to see how things are being done and well. If not, then we need to correct some things and how to correct those things. So reviewing the plans and programs. This is something CDTM, I believe, and what it does is to adapt the adaptation in the implementation of contribution of some determined contributions at the national level. And what we propose here is to have a revision of contribution of this contribution. I would like to say here something that contributions determined at national level were elaborated with some urgency because it had to do with October 2015. So in some countries indicated thought, especially in the goals and the objectives, all this part of process was there, with some exceptions. Of course, it was not that well developed, and that is part of what the country has to do, how to implement contributions. That is something that means a really important effort, because it's about putting to work some transformations. And as a consequence of those transformations, in the mitigation part, academic activities, there will be losers and winners. In order to have this political support for those transformations, there needs to be a really well-organized planning. We have a sequence also here that continues with the governance, the planning, the preparation, the financing thing, and then effective implementation that involves the implementation of policies and projects, and also the process of effectiveness. These orientations are the proposed of a GIZ work. This is some sort of coincidence, just to show you the similarities among these orientations and sometimes guidelines. So basically the steps to take are similar. And finally, there are some indications that were prepared by the technical secretary of the DAC, and I just put them there because I think that work on the same thing. There's something that previous idea of reconfiguration of the whole system that I think is quite complex. This imply, in a sense, to carry out some deep changes, and then the management of knowledge, action, building capacities, governance, the idea of the need of a common sense. Governance appears here as an intermediate part of the process. First, we have this governance structure, and then we continue with the progress. As for the configuration of the system, what SLACS proposes is suggests that the system was initially focused in mitigation. Adaptation and mitigation were treated differently, and that this needs to be thought about and then defined as a new institutional framework and for policies for this experimentation to keep in time. And we go from a vision to another systematic vision. When I want to confirm this, one of the difficulties is adaptation is general. The diagram of the government and some other things over the countries, adaptation was as a priority. It need to be priority of the ministries of environment, especially because not all countries have the same national regulation. So adaptation would appear concentrated as a government area and competence area, while mitigation, in order to be executed efficiently, involved Ministry of Transportation, Energy, Agriculture, management of disposals, key areas where there are sources of these situations. Mitigations also should be applied in different levels, at the national level, and at the province level and local level. This reconfiguring of the system apparently is not easy. As for knowledge management, here we propose some sort of analysis or deepening of knowledge regarding the benefits and the creation of indicators for synergies. Of course, this has some complexities, and it is a process that needs to progress slowly. Because as for the indication, for the metrics of the indication, is not easy to be accomplished. So identification of benefits of how we interact in action of climate change, how we interact in this efforts of mitigation with adaptation, it is also complex, and we need to do a great effort, intellectual effort, to have a precise measure of these benefits. that are not always easy to accomplish. And also regarding incentives. It is not easy to find some sort of schema structure of incentives, because in general the adaptation has to do with producing, accomplishing, generating changes in living conditions of citizens of a country. For example, avoiding some things, give some more security, face to extreme climate events, to improve living conditions. And mitigation is a point we have to measure carbon tons, and then difference in concepts are important. In the dictionary of the Spanish language has a definition of what we call synergies. It refers to the combination of two or more causes of the effect that is greater than the sum of the individual effects. But also we appeal the Latin, we talk about synergies as a coordinated task, and synergy is cooperation also, coordinated task, cooperation. So we need to integrate actions, or that leads actions. There should be a cooperation in these actions in order to implement the conceptions of implementation of actions. And then the idea of to accomplish this, sum should be the total sum should be more than the combination of the parts. It is quite useful. Is it possible to synergize, or should we go further and we should integrate the action, the climate action? And the second question that you need to answer in each case for each of your countries is that, is it possible to restructure the system, or should we take small steps in the aims of getting results? I think time's up. I will deal with this financing issue. From the financing, what are these obstacles to solve synergistically? As you can see here, quotes. There are some parts of it that are more difficult. What do donors prioritize when they prioritize this? In general, donors, they want to show results, and yes, of course, mitigation, we have very important results there. But when we are in the moment of mitigation, what we want to accomplish is to reduce massively greenhouse effect gases. So priority is sometimes easier to show when we talk about tons, or we talk about economic results, or when we talk about improvement of the quality. And this is reasonable because donor country have to respond to citizens who vote, who are also voted, and they have to take into account this, and they have to show results, concrete results. From these financial institutions, they are worried about adaptation and mitigation. But sometimes it is easier. The economic and financing indicators are too sophisticated nowadays, so it's easier to see. And even there are some difficulties, because if we talk about synergies, there are some problems also to find this. Clearly, the idea of the result should be measured easily in a mitigation and adaptation. The Greenhouse Fund for Climate considers the results of the success of the exit strategies. What do we happen when this ends the green fund for the climate project? So the idea of financing robustness, economic financial robustness is key. And as governments prioritize, naturally they have priorities as for assignation of resources, which are quite scarce in many circumstances. So priorities sometimes set political incorrect. Sometimes priority is the actions that are more visible instead of actions that go to the core, because it takes time. It takes time to realize, to accomplish. And what criteria do we use to prioritize? Of equity, efficiency? How do we compare KH reductions with improvements in resilience of the systems, of the whole society? And how to decide in these cases if we go towards mitigation, financial mitigation, adaptation, if I don't have comparable indicators. And this is something clear as a study regarding how we assign financing. One number, 17 billion US dollars, is less than 10% goes to projects with a local approach, meaning that when we look at this number and we look at the proportion of the amount of money that goes to this type of activities, if we consider a fund that is national and global, we can see that local funding is quite reduced. Here we have the interjurisdictional tensions with the presence of policies. Who do we finance or what do we finance? The tensions that is seen in the Ministry of Environment. What capacities have the Ministry of Environment to mobilize resources for the situation for the energetic systems, airports, roads, etc. And also, in this matter, the mobilization of resources, the importance of the presence of the private sector, of all civil society, and domestic resources that, as we can see, financing, international financing, comes with a little delay. Finally, key messages. I think the strengthening of governance, the insurance of transferring high work in order to have the capacity to the funds, and the equity are essential elements for creating good adaptation plans, national adaptation plans. And also, we need to increase something in assuring the marginal economy or the capital. That is, we know that sources never rest, especially when we have so many demanding from the society. Processes need to go towards decrease of the utilization of assets and install capitals. All infrastructure, economic infrastructure and social infrastructure have to be protected. So we need to add that into the account. Adaptation helps us to protect the capital of the society, that a capital that took years to accumulate, that is precious, that is vital. And also we need to contribute to the long-term legitimacy of climate action, assuring that the most vulnerable groups, the protected groups, the ones that don't have a voice, those who don't vote, or those who are not represented in this scenario. Where we build political agendas and where we celebrate agreements, all those who are not represented have to be represented, because this is a process of change, of transformation, in a really brutal point for his impact, for the changes required. We go towards a world that we just can barely think of, and legitimacy, political legitimacy in the long term is essential. So this is the end of my presentation, so I give the floor back to the moderator. Thank you very much, Hernan. It was a pleasure to hear your presentation and to learn a little bit more about the complexity of opportunities and challenges of integration of additional climate change in integrated actions. Also, the panorama of advanced and proposed, so presented as how to guide national addition plans with different frameworks and to adapt orientations, for example, NAPS or the sustainable development, as well as factors to take into account for the finances. So thank you very much for your time and this presentation. So interested. So after, I would like to say that after the two presentations, we'll have a question answer moment with the speakers, where we could have, you can send some questions in the chat, and they will be answered by the speakers. Since we heard from Hernan, discussions have evolved, they have adopted a vision approach that need look for actions, synergies, synergies with adaptation and mitigation. And that's why it is of great importance to define criteria in order to analyze these synergies, adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development also in these proposals among the plans of adaptation, NDCs, and other engagements in the country. And with that question, actually, we would like to invite our second speaker, Javier Barrios. Just a moment. Claudia is an expert in climate change, adaptation to climate change, human natural resources, and agriculture in UN environment. It is a pleasure to have her in our webinar. And just one question that we would like to put on the table in this panel of experts, and how to define where and how to invest for in adaptation in the most efficient way. So, Claudia has the floor. Good morning. Thank you. Thank you, Lily, for facilitating this space. Thank you, Renan, for this previous presentation. I will take some points, and everybody who is participating. Can you hear me well? I will then verify. Just a moment. Great. I would join my previous presentation with a specific part, or what we call adaptation actions, meaning that when we formulate a plan, how do we know where and how to invest in mitigation adaptation in the most efficient way? I will present a proposal developed initially by the CATIE, which is institute, so a big shout out to Freddy, who is also participating here. And with whom I collaborated many years. So this proposal is centered in the management of natural resources and agriculture. And I'm going to talk about it. And it was developed and pilot for 2 countries of Central America, a region where we had the impact of drought and some other extreme events, and was done with available public information. Of course, the development of a proposal for national adaptation plan for adaptation to climate change had to go to different sectors, so the exercise would be more complex. But what I want to present is to progress. For that, I would like to retake something that Hernan mentioned. So the 2 ways, as mentioned, now adaptation goes for a rural path. We do need to take efforts. The efforts in the metrics, generally indicators of carbon indicators when we talk about accumulated tons, carbon tons, that for adaptation there were some progress indicators, but basically they refer to cost of loss, avoided cost infrastructure, and therefore that's where adaptation is centered in risk and extreme events, geological events, especially droughts and same thing, for example, of pollination in the ecosystem, which is fundamental for agriculture, and since it's difficult to measure, bees are not that important in the political platform, so they are left aside. When we talk about legitimacy, we talk also about services that are quite important for sectors that actually are not so centered in economic agenda, or for the criteria that is not, and that are not considering decision making. The question, where and how to invest in mitigation adaptation from this approach of management of human resources in agriculture. So we need to establish 2 start points. First, the climate action projects are based in ecosystem projects. Thanks to the evolution of ecosystem millennia, we all have very much present that they have these type of services, and the operation requirements are more. So water, for example, matter, adaptation, wood, etc. But also ecosystem systems of climate regulations, hydric water modulation, are quite important for adaptation. The other point mentioned by Hernan is that mitigation actions need to contribute to a sustainable adaptation. So the LAC report published last year highlights this point. So when we talk about synergies, we talk also about synergies with sustainable development, and not only the services of ecosystems, but like water, but also to strengthening of capacities that change, what we call generally capacity of adaptation. Going back to the question, how to define what and where to invest in adaptation. Where, if we have projects to carry out, where do we put them, and how do we design those projects? From that point of view, from that approach, the first step to follow was to define the services, ecosystem services for analysis, and they need to be directly linked to the priorities of the country or the region of the space that we are analyzing. Our work that I simplified, we have 3 services related basically for adaptation. First is for authorization and regulation, water for human consumption, water and watering and energy, and the other is related to recuperation, which is stabilization of cold places, for example, of hills, for example, when we have landslides. The third service would be to maintaining the biodiversity. We have 2 services related basically to mitigation, which is the biomass for energy. and global carbon. So we have this list of ecosystem services which are priorities related to the policies of the country. The second step is to establish criteria to, in a way, to assign some punctuation, some points objectively and transparently to the mitigation projects and adaptation projects. And for that, we are basing how to contribute this project to the offer of these services. For example, to maintain or to improve the offer of these priority ecosystem services and the demand existing for a service. Let's not forget that the concept of ecosystem service is quite important. So it's good, the provision of water for human consumption, but of course a project that provides clean water, of quality water during the whole year to populations that are down the basin is more important than a project that generates clean water of quality during the whole year for a place where there is no demand of this resource. So we have to consider these two things: the strengthening of the offer of the ecosystem service and the demand. So let's take a look for the water for human consumption and energy, which is more clear an ecosystem service that is quite more important for the countries of the region. The demand would be defined in this case by the project due by the density of the population, zone of watering, and hydroelectric down the basin the project. Down basin, and it will be defined by the capacity of the project to keep the quality and the amount of water. So, for example, our service of provisioning and regulation. According for the certification of lands, it would be defined by the population down the basin exposed to this type of movements, and the offer would be defined by the capacity of the project to civilize the lands. With biodiversity, we can assume that the demand of the combination is global. So it's not as easy to assign a project with a criteria, so the offer would be related to the degree of naturality of the country inside. In the practice, we can assume that if the project helps, for example, to recover forests that are near a protected area or biological corridors, we are contributing biodiversity, and because instead in opposition to the recovery of projects in isolated areas that won't contribute. So that was the practical criteria about how near or far are in the zones, the connectivity area of ecosystem services. As for the carbon, we have a global demand here as well, but we can assess the offer. It is easy or hard to accumulate this and biomass. The demand is more local demand, and those are the places that are near the project. So where we have this access to this, regardless if it's down or up the basin, and the offer is also defined by this recovery carbon. So let's not forget about the criteria in order to assess if the project contributes to or the action contributes or not to the response of the climate of populations and local organizations. We have a predatory ecosystem, we have criteria, and then we have what we can work with metrics in order to define comparable punctuations. So as for the mitigation measures, they're quite defined, is something that defined by now. Adaptation is a small, strong challenge, but in a way we need to learn in a practical scale. In that case, we are trying to establish metrics of demand. For example, carrying out some rankings of demand, considering the amount of population supplied of carbon, but pretty easy, the proximity in kilometers, in protected areas, we talk about the biodiversity, and we talk about infrastructure or population that would be affected by slight zones. So this is in a gross mother, but with the expert criteria and using a threshold that is transparent and documenting in the best way possible. We will be able to establish a first time metric. And the important thing here is to assign, and we use a 1 to 5 scale, for example, this scale, etc. Amount of. So we put this into a scale of 1 to 5, and to assign points according to the capacity to strengthening the offer and to establish demand of these services. These three frameworks, the identification of the ecosystem services to assign criteria to esteem, offer, and demand, and to think how do we measure with the available information the support of this project in order to support this offer. This is a quite important exercise in order to strengthen the decisions of the organizations. The fourth step is to locate each project in, let's say, prototype projects in the NAPS, and to relate what were the services or ecosystems related to this, and we evaluate this. So with that result, we were at least able to define action groups or project groups. Effectively, we identify actions or projects that generate what we call synergies. For example, a typical example is to explode the wood, non-wood projects in products in the basin that has important populations of it in the medium or low basin. So this project provides goods related to wood to the communities. So high basin, we support the creation of forestal projects, so it improves the water quality and lands in times of rain, and so it contributes greatly to the offer of the regulation. It also strengthens the community organization, meaning that there's capacity to do adaptation, and it avoids and contributes to the conservation of the diversity. That is an example. Very nice example of these synergy actions. So it's a project that contributes for mitigation as for adaptation. We also have projects that generate benefits for adaptation or for mitigation, but we do not identify synergies, and that also is related to where the project is located. What are the components? For example, a captation for water from rain with reservoirs of some material, for example, cement. It could have an impact for the production of water for the human consumption, but it won't have other benefits for adaptation that would be obtained maybe for recovering water recharge zones. So the benefit for one topic of one adaptation matter has to do with the planning. And one example that has to do with the placement of the project is with the project of reforestation. Let's say, for example, if the project is intended to recover carbon, and if this the basin, you would contribute to reclamation of water and land, but if it's located in a place where there are many services, there would be a project that aims to mitigation. An important part is that we are able to identify action projects that generate conflicts among mitigation and adaptation. For example, a watering project basic with agriculture can create a conflict. It reduces the possibility of water for energy. The use of fossil fuels for water, generated water, could generate negative impacts for the objectives of the mitigation, and that we add if we do not the possible effects of salinization on soil degradation. It's not well designed. So in the short term, you could have some benefits for agriculture, but we don't know that in the long term. Other quite common are plantations of biofuels for food production and reduce the availability of water. So these are some things that support the mitigation or adaptation, but could create conflict. So it is a project that we need to discuss. The mechanism is not a bad mechanism, but it has to do to what age do we associate this? Where do we put this? I believe Dilly is already, we don't have much time. I would just like to end by saying that the accomplishment of synergies is not spontaneous, and that we need to use the best knowledge as possible and to have a most participative approach for the design. Let's not forget that among the criteria we need to add the contribution to the building national capacities and the understanding of the ecosystem services that would be maintained and generated, and the type and quantity of users that would be benefiting from this. Those are the points that I'm going to conclude with. Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for respecting the time. The interesting presentation and to discuss with us your experience and the proposal. How can we use, for example, an ecosystem approach to see this is to synergy of adaptation mitigation? And it would be interesting to share more experiences. There are publications that you have regarding topics, so we will share this with the participants. Now we have some time to discuss with participants, and I would like to ask you if you could write down your questions on the chat. If you represent the organization, and for whom it would be the question, whether for Claudia or for Hernan or for both of them. Let's take some minutes to wait for your questions, and we received 2 questions already for Hernan. And I'm going to read them while you write other questions. Hernan, there is a question from Rafael. He asked about your opinion regarding the case of Bolivia, where we assume the adaptation commission from the strategy based on the concept of Bolivia, with the protection, restoration, and preservation of environmental functions of Mother Earth. And Anticopa, question from Bolivia, I think is perfect what you say in your presentation, but it is important adaptation of the productive processes as well as social, urban processes and rural processes. With that, I give the floor to Hernan to answer those questions while we wait for the other questions from the participants. Just a moment. Thank you very much. I was following the chat, the questions and interventions of Rafael that was quite active in expressing his opinion. But one thing is that I do not want to give my opinion regarding what a country does, due to respect the sovereign decisions of each country. But if I need to decide what is more attractive to me, I would say that it would be difficult to think about addition that would be linked to strategies. And I mentioned, I think this in my presentation, the idea of assuring that citizens of each country have access to work, to opportunities, to health, and freedom and dignity and future for their children. So the well-being, well-living is important. This is materialized differently by each country. How do we combine this development idea in the long-term sustainable with the preservation of environment is not easy, and as I see it, we will see the ones that will have to look to do this dramatic changes. So we refer to this in the document in a key matter. So the human development is not associated to the possession almost infinite of goods. And we will live by force probably in a world more where we're lacked of things, as German and Japanese studies mentioned, within a different world. Each country should try to live in the way they want to live. I refer to also the question to the social capital that includes the productive assets and all productive assets. I think it's quite risky to think in new investments without considering the climate risks and extreme scenarios of change in conditions where we can develop activities, and that goes for the livestock sector and for the energy sector. For example, the building of a road or the investment in dwellings. Adaptation would be a central dimension to planification of public planning and also for considering the private projects. I'm sure of it. And if we don't see this, probably we will pay this with a high cost. Thank you, Hernan. Thank you for your response. I see two questions that are also for both speakers, but I will give the floor to Claudia. One of the participants, Clifton of Peru, is trying to ask the master plans of mitigation of climate change at the level of basins in most of the cases are rejected by organisms in charge of approving the financing of governments, even when it is shown that we spend 10 times more of activities of rehabilitation and recuperation of infrastructure. So the question is how to change this practice from the PENAC community. This is for us a question, but I'm sure Claudia could give us her vision. And some other thing, our question is a more concrete question from Luis. It could be for both speakers. Luis from Mexico. What could be the specific steps in order to start the process of adaptation, a process of adaptation plan? taking into account the mitigation synergies. Claudia, you have the floor. Thank you, Libby. For specific questions, I do not know regarding this specific case, but I will make the effort to respond with something quite generic from my experience. There is a project with Agrode in a part of its elaboration that has to do with norms in order to approve plans of land ordering at a municipal level in other countries. So part of this is the training of people in charge, because we can face things such as there are people that mix climate change mitigation with some more climate mitigation, which is normal. It is quite important. Everything is important, but it is not aligned to the thousands of regulations and public instruments. So we need to carry out a quite strong effort in order to not to give the documents to everybody instead of selecting. We need to select as well to experience what are technical experiences of these filters that are making these proposals to be rejected. Probably they have to do to the weakness of the metrics. And I felt that even when they say it is important to have strong numbers, we need to understand to document, have transparent processes for things that are not to be measured quite objectively. That is a process we are supporting to do a diagnosis, to evidence the impact of this failed practice, to identify what are the things that need to be improved, how to generalize the analysis for the pilot, and how to improve the practice. That from the point of view of the governmental management. As for the other question, I believe that there are established processes, there are manuals, and each country has to do the way of initiating these processes. I believe that a common point also for different countries is the vulnerability analysis of climate change, or analysis of vulnerability and risk of climate change from the informer IPCC, the reporter IPCC. To generate this analysis is done by sectors, the energy sector, infrastructure, the city, etc. So one thing that we mentioned among colleagues is that adaptation of a sector could be disadaptation of another sector. For example, water energy is reserved to some zones for the generational zone for some techniques. It should affect the agriculture sector, for example. So I believe there is not a recipe of success. But we need to identify also clearly what are the possible synergies of adaptation among sectors and the evident conflicts that we could have. And also to level sectors that are more aparted and from sectors that have a presence that is quite strong. For processes that are being done for quite some time, it could be an evidence. And if I repeat this with the previous response, I think adaptation plans are good, but I think we need to see what are the additional plans and to analyze well what are the sector plans to intervene there, to make it cross-cutting. That is what we do in practice at the municipality level, not to create new municipal plans of adaptation, but to include them. Thank you. Thank you very much, Claudia, for your response. We can share also the documents, guidelines for the necessary steps. As Claudia mentioned, for each country is different, but there are some things that need to go with other countries. So we can share the information. Thank you very much again for both for your exceptional presentations. I hope that we have answered most of the questions from the participants. And with that, thank you very much for your participation. And we will send and share the recording in English and Spanish, as well as the PPTs, the presentations. Thank you very much. I would really appreciate if you could respond a short survey regarding the organization of this webinar, the content, and the dynamic. All this information will be sent in the following days by email to everybody. Thank you very much from this practice community, PNAC, UN Environment, Practical Action. It was a pleasure, and we will see you in the next webinar. Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.